Hello, welcome back. And yes, I know a few of you are probably thinking, hang on, I thought today was supposed to be Pathfinder 2nd edition, so why is the title of the live stream saying something else? Why does it say My Dungeons and Dragons 5e House Rules? Because I simply did not have enough time to prepare all the material I needed for Pathfinder, and so therefore I'm doing this. And because I've kind of talked about these topics scattered throughout my live streams in sort of various places, a bit here, a bit there. I thought I would just focus on the topic completely since it's something I actually know a lot about, since it's my house rules, and I run the game very differently to a lot of people now. So I thought I would at least sort of cover that and see what you think. You know, maybe you'll take some of this, maybe you won't. My suggestion: grab some food, some drink, make sure you're comfortable. I'm going to put up a poll. Feel free to take part in that poll, and feel free to share your approach to house rolling 5e, or in fact any game that you're playing. It doesn't need to be 5e. Okay, so there will be some dice and miniatures being used, and I will certainly be using the camera on my face as well and explaining stuff. So I'm not just going to tell you what I do, but I'm going to explain why I do something. And therefore, I think it's a better way of you determining whether it's something that you see value in or whether you think it's really not for you. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. Let's start there. Hi, welcome to How to RPG. My name is Fred Wheeler, and today I want to play. Actually, I don't know if that I'm going to say this the right way. I want to play role playing games, but particularly Dungeons and Dragons 5e my way. And I think that goes for a lot of game masters. Once you've sort of got the gist of the version of D&D that you're playing, or the role playing game you've got at your table, there's the desire to actually include some of your take on how to do something. And I have been doing this for a while now, primarily because I'm not completely satisfied with the rules the way they are. And so I keep making adjustments. Things that seem logical to me in some way, things that I don't understand why Wizards of the Coast hasn't already done this, or somebody else hasn't done this. Okay, so this is why I sort of think this way, and this is why I'm trying to do it that way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and explain how I do something, and then I'm going to sort of demonstrate it a little bit using the maps, miniatures, and dice. And you'll see, obviously, a slight difference. In some cases, a huge difference to what you're familiar with 5e. And yes, and then you can make a sort of an assessment about how you feel about that. So the first thing I'm going to say is there's a thing called the passive check, okay? And I really don't use the passive check much anymore, if at all, frankly. I almost never use the passive check, passive perception for a player character, unless they insist. I have a few players occasionally who will sort of insist in using the passive perception or a passive check, but usually the passive check I haven't had a problem with. It's usually the passive perception. Some of my players still struggle to let go of passive perception. And the reason why I have gotten rid of passive perception is I don't really think that it needed to be there. Now, it has a purpose, and I understand the purpose. I like the idea behind the purpose of having passive perception, which is basically passive perception or a passive check is it's your skill modifier plus 10. Okay, and it means you don't have to worry about rolling dice. It speeds up the game. You can stop people, metagaming, all that sort of stuff. I'm all for that. But that calculation, I feel, is completely unnecessary because there's another number or another set of numbers on the character sheet that we almost never use. And as a result of never using them, it's like, why did you have them there in the first place? Why did you not just use them? And so I decided to actually try and put that into practice at my table. And that is the skill. The skill check is all very well, but we don't need that because in the past really didn't focus so much on skills. So I use the ability score. So I use strength score, your dexterity score, your intelligence score. I use wisdom scores. I use charisma scores. I use the I use those constitution scores. I use those for a lot of my what would be a passive check of some kind, instead of falling back on 10 plus whatever the skill modifier is, or the ability modifier is, depending on what you're trying to do. So, and the reason being is, one, it's easy to, it's already there on the character sheet, and two, it makes sense. Those ability scores are actually related to how well you do something. And I know a lot of people will say, yes, but that doesn't take into consideration if you're trained. And I've had this discussion with my players before, and I've said, look, the reality is that whatever training you have, I'm sure has an impact. But ultimately, with a game system where you're rolling a 20-sided dice, and you have a very small modifier being added to that, or even any kind of number added to that, it's not necessarily, or even, it's not even significant. It just doesn't have the same reliability as a static number. And I've been saying this for a while, that, you know, D&D may well go the way of there being a lot less dice rolling. Now, probably not going to be for Wizards of the Coast, because players love rolling dice. What my home group has discovered is that when they know that they can reliably do something because it's being based off a static number, the chances are they will be more successful more often, and actually they are happy to give up the dice rolling aspect of it, so they don't have to worry about rolling a 1, 2, or a 3 or something like that, and have a static number as a reliable source. So I'm going to actually just switch over and just show you how ridiculous the situation is when it comes to how our numbers on our character sheet look. And let me just move this around a little bit. I'll move you guys over here for now. We'll come back to you, because we'll be talking about other stuff as well. Okay, so this is your character sheet, right? And one of the most annoying things is you have two numbers related to your strength. You got your strength modifier, you got your strength score. They're already calculated here. And then on our character sheet, we have this one number which we tend to use quite a lot if you're using passive perception. And that's passive perception. Sometimes you'll have passive investigation or insight or something like that. Most of the time people aren't using passive checks for stealth, all of their skills. They're not using like a passive acrobatics. I'm sure there are some people. But again, you know, that's just, seriously, it's just another number you have to create that's formed by other numbers. And so this is how I approach a sort of a static number check to make it really, really easy for myself and for everybody else at the table. Okay, you want to make a perception check. Okay, that's fine. You want to see or hear something in the environment. That's what my players will be describing. And so I will say to them, okay, tell me what your wisdom score is. And they'll tell me it's a 10. And after a while, I'll start to remember these numbers because, you know, get familiar with your players, don't you? Okay, so is the 10 the wisdom score, which is usually related to perception, is that equal to or greater than the difficulty class or DC for whatever they're trying to notice? And usually, if it is, and it's good enough, then that's it. That's the end of it. We don't go any further. But if it's not good enough, and they wouldn't be able to detect them, that's when I say, okay, now you can make a wisdom or perception check. You can actually now roll the dice. That means that they've always got a better than average chance of getting a success on whatever the check is. Because, of course, if you can never go below your wisdom score or your ability score in some way, that means you're probably going to succeed more often rather than fail more often. And you might be thinking, well, Fred, well, that just means you've eliminated consequences for actions. And I really have never found that to be the case at all. If anything, it means that good plans work and bad plans don't work. Because if they have a bad plan, I wouldn't say, tell me what your wisdom score is. I'd say what you're trying to do isn't going to work, so there's no point asking for that. So that's one aspect of how I run my games. So there's a lot less dice rolling in my games because of that, because I am using a static number most of the time. And the only time I'm really using a passive check or a passive perception check is when the players are really they've built their character around a particular feat or whatever, and they just can't get past that. That doesn't happen very often. It's very, very rare. Sometimes it's just a matter of people just forgetting what I'm trying to do. And the feedback from my group has been pretty good. I don't know if that'll be the same for you, but that's what I've found in my game. So I don't use ability checks and skill checks as a dice roll very often. It's not common. Another thing that I do in my game, and I saw that Wizards of the Coast was trying to do this in their playtest, and I was thinking, oh, finally, because there's a lot of people already doing this. Like, that's good. And that is, when you roll a 20-sided dice, the result of your 20-sided dice should have some sort of impact on your game. And it's really weird that if you are asking for a dice roll for whether there's going to be a chance to succeed or fail, that a 1 does not fail every single time. Or that if you manage to roll a natural 20 on your 20-sided dice roll because somebody's asked you for an ability check, a skill check, a saving throw, an attack roll, that a 20 doesn't always succeed. And what was really interesting to me is that with attack rolls, we have accepted, the general community has accepted for 5e, that if you roll a 20, it's a critical hit, it's an automatic hit, doesn't matter whatever modifiers you have, it's always going to hit. Doesn't matter how high the armor class is, it's always going to hit. And not only that, it's a critical hit. Now, I'm not saying that I use critical fumbles, because I don't use critical fumbles, but a 1 is always a failure for me. Now, we've accepted that they are for an attack roll. Okay, you roll a 1 on your 20-sided dice with your attack and you fail. And yet, we won't apply it to an ability check, a skill check, or a saving throw. And the arguments I've always seen by people about that sort of thing have always been quite ridiculous. Like, well, that means they can now achieve anything just by rolling dice, or they could fail when they really shouldn't fail. Well, here's the thing. Because I very rarely ask for a dice roll from the players, so if their static numbers are very, very, very high, I would never be asking them to roll a 20-sided dice in the first place. You know, if they're trying to do something that's impossible, I wouldn't be asking them to roll a dice. If they decide to roll a dice and I didn't ask for it, I do just ignore that dice roll. I just ignore it. It's not part of my game. Sorry, shouldn't have rolled the dice because I didn't ask for that dice roll. You can't just game it by the numbers. And, you know, I have actually sort of flattened the game out to the bottom end of things. We don't get these great, huge variations. My players' characters in the game, they're usually pretty good at most things. And then occasionally they're even better if they dice roll and they get a good number, which is better than their static ability score. So when it came to something like an ability check, a skill check, or a saving throw, and we were rolling dice, I decided, well, okay, a 1 needs to be a failure every single time, and a 20 is a success. That's it. Because it falls in line with the other dice roll, which was for the attack roll. It makes sense to make, I guess for me, at my table, the rolls consistent right across, rather than having all of these different versions or variations going on. What's really interesting that I thought was even more entertaining is in the past, Dungeons & Dragons 3.5 stipulated that if you rolled a 1, it was a failure. And if you rolled a 20, it was a success. So, but they never applied it to ability and skill checks as far as I could tell. But with a saving throw, it did apply there. So there is precedence from other versions of the game that this is sort of the approach that you could use. Now, I know a lot of people already do this because it just makes sense. And the outlying arguments have no merit whatsoever as far as I'm concerned, because, if you can't fail the dice roll but you're rolling dice, then what the hell are you doing rolling the dice? And if you can't possibly achieve a task, then why the heck are you rolling the dice in the first place as well? Those are things that sort of go through my mind when I think about how this game is played. And ultimately, in the end, that's sort of the approach that I've gone with, and it's worked really well for me. if anything, I think this is the one thing that I would have really have liked to have seen in the play test actually survive, and it didn't. Um, and if it would be a shame that we never revisit that. I honestly don't think that there is any point in having a situation where you can't achieve something because, heck, the number was too big, or you should never have been able to succeed anyway. So let's make you roll a dice and then to say, ha ha ha, you got a 20, but you still didn't get it, you know? So yeah, for me, that is one of those house rules which I have no intentions of changing. So if I have the players roll a 1 on a 20-sided dice for an ability check, a skill check, for a saving throw or an attack roll, that is an automatic failure, okay? Because if you can't fail when you're rolling the dice, then why roll the dice in the first place? So that's one of the first things that I definitely do a lot of. And then when it comes to a 20, if you're rolling a 20, it's a big deal, right? It's a big deal when you roll a 20. So if you roll a 20 for your attack roll, your ability check, your skill check, your saving throws, any kind of D20 check whatsoever, any D20 dice roll, you get a 20, you succeed. Because if you're rolling the dice, you should be able to succeed. Otherwise, don't roll the dice. And I've found this to be a very sensible rule. It makes so much sense, and I don't know why we don't have it as a standard rule in Dungeons & Dragons 5e, and that's my house rule. So, yes. I don't know that necessarily today is going to be one of those days where people are going to agree with everything I have to say, or even going to comment that much. Feel free to share how you do your game, by all means. Okay, so those are the couple of things I do, and I've explained sort of why I do it that way. There's another thing that I do that I guess what I would like to do is I'm going to just write this up. Skill DCs. Like, whether you're making an ability check or a skill check, I've always found that the numbering for it, I don't have a problem with the numbering in terms of, 5 is very easy, 10 is easy, going up to 30, which is being near impossible, right? But not impossible. The problem for me that I've found with a game system that operates this way is there are certain numbers on here that don't make any sense. Like, why are we using them in the first place? And so what I'm going to do is sort of suggest that there are certain numbers that I don't even bother using. And for very good reason. I've almost found that there is no real good reason to have a DC that's too low. So a difficulty class that's too low just doesn't make sense to me. So why use them? So if 5 is very easy, 10 is easy, 15 is medium, 20 is hard, 25 is very hard, and 30 is near impossible, I don't use 5. Cross that out. You'll never see a DC from me that is a 5. Because anything that's very easy, why are we rolling it? They're probably always going to succeed. And then because 10 is also easy, I almost never use that as well. There is one exception where I might use a 10, and that is when we're dealing with a knowledge check. The only DCs that I will tend to use are anything that is 11 or above, and I never make a DC greater than 30. That's it. Because anything greater than 30 is impossible to achieve. Because this, remember, is 30 is near impossible. So that's the only range I have. I still have these here, but I never actually use them because it doesn't make any sense to me. Now, I know Dungeons & Dragons, Wizards of the Coast has a lot of DC 10s here. I just don't bother in using those. I just always bump them up and make them a bit higher. Okay, they'll wind up being an 11 or a 12 if it's really supposed to be, reasonably easy but not super easy. I don't like using 10s. I don't see any value in it. And one of the things that it does is it means that excessive rolls that really have no purpose behind them, we don't engage in. Hello. Now, let me see if I get your name right, because your name is going to throw me just a little bit, because I'm going to struggle, and I always feel a bit bad when I do. Let me just jump back to the screen. So is it Andrew? Is it Andrew Ramirez Ladina? Ladina. You tell me if I got the name wrong, okay? But I think it's Andrew, correct? With the U on the end. Hi, I've started to add some Baldur's Gate 3 rules to my games. Yes, just to make them more dynamic and fun, like the fact of spell scrolls being used by any character. Okay, interesting. Yes, I got a name. Okay, awesome. So one of the things, it's an interesting idea. I don't know that most spell scrolls in 5e can already be used by just about every single character anyway. If you look at the rules the way they are written, just about everything can be used. I think it's kind of a shame because it means that things like, things that traditionally that were done by the rogue, like use magic device, or using scrolls and magic items, they kind of lost that somewhere along the line. But that's beside the point. Whether I agree with it or I think it's lost something, it's how you want to run your game. This is the whole point. This is why I'm telling you why I do things a particular way. You're doing it because you think it's fun and dynamic. And that's really, as long as you think it's good for the game and your players like it, like, who cares? Nobody else's opinion really matters. Okay, let me go over another thing that I tend to do. And I've kind of talked about this in my videos in the past, but I actually do use it in my game a lot. And that is knowledge checks and skill checks and ability checks. Now, when it comes to something where I think they should be skilled in that task, if you look at 5e, totally agree. Oh, I'm glad you agree, Andrew. So when it comes to knowledge checks, this is what I do. Knowledge checks for me have always been a little bit weird. Some of the skill checks have always been a little bit weird. And so what I have sort of insisted is that we use a different DC for people who are trained and untrained in knowledges. So the knowledges like nature, arcana, history, and what's the history, nature, arcana, and what's the other one? I'm sure there's another one and I can't remember off the top of my head what the heck it is. But yeah, the knowledge skills, those things where you're supposed to know something. If they are trained in it or proficient in it, then I let them roll dice. But only if, of course, their intelligence score is not high enough to get them success. I'm always going to be using their intelligence score for that because that's where our knowledge skills are based off intelligence, right? So if they're rolling dice for that, great. Now, if somebody is not trained, the chances are they won't have a particularly good intelligence score anyway, and that their score probably won't be beyond a 10. But when they're not trained and they're trying to make a knowledge check, I double the DC. So the DC for somebody who's trained might be 10 and above. So 10 would be sort of common information and knowledge, and then 15 would be harder, and then 20 would be more difficult again, and then 30 is almost near impossible information to know about. So their DCs don't change. But for somebody who's not proficient and not trained in a knowledge particularly, I double their DC. So instead of a DC 10, which somebody who's trained in would have, the untrained or unproficient person, arcana, nature, history, religion. That's right, religion. Thank you. Thank you, Andrew. I double the DC. So that means that a DC 10 for somebody who's proficient and trained is a DC 20 for somebody who's untrained. The other thing is they can never get information or knowledge that's any better than common knowledge, which means they're never going to be able to get stuff that's better than a standard 10. I did say I use 10s for my DCs for knowledge checks usually, but not for other stuff, right? Other times I don't use a DC 10. And I've found that worked quite well. What that does is it rewards somebody not for being lucky and rolling really well on a 20-sided dice. I don't want to reward luck because they just happen to roll really luckily and well on a dice, and it just the fates were with them. I want them to put their training into a particular area. If they're trained in a particular area, they should be better at it than somebody else. So somebody who's not trained when it comes to knowledge is always going to find a dice roll much harder to achieve. And because their character's probably not built for knowledge, their intelligence score is probably no greater than 10. So they're always going to have to roll a dice and just hope that they roll better than getting, 10, because their DC is now a 20. I know that sounds terribly unfair. And probably at some tables they're thinking that's just not right. But there are a few skills that I simply don't let people make at all unless they are proficient or trained in them. And in 5e right now, I believe if you want to try to pick a lock with thieves' tools, you have to be proficient with the thieves' tools. You have to be trained with thieves' tools. And you need to have the thieves' tools. You can't use a dagger or the tip of your sword or something silly like that. Opening a lock is actually not that easy. You need to have proper tools to do it. And so there are times where even if they could potentially get a score of a check of a 20, I would not allow them to roll the dice for that. I'm not going to let the fighter roll for some thieves' tools they picked up and found lying about because they've never been trained in how to use them, and just because they managed to roll really well on the dice, plus whatever penalty, benefits and bonuses they can get from somebody else, somebody assisting them and help actions and stuff like that, spells. I just, no. The only person who can do that is going to be the rogue or somebody who's proficient in thieves' tools. That's it. And I do that a couple of times with a few things, but not all the skills. I don't always do that. It still opens it up so that you can, any character can potentially try anything, but there are definitely some limitations. I think that seems reasonable to me. Certain things are just more difficult. It would be ridiculous, for example, to say, okay, an untrained person should be able to make an arcana check. So a knowledge on magic. What knowledge would they know about magic? Really, almost nothing. So I often, when somebody says, what do I need to know about this? You need arcana. You need to know about magic. And I said, well, I'm trained. I'm not trained. Well, the untrained person is not going to get to make a knowledge check on arcana because it doesn't make any sense. But things like nature and history and religion, you can pick these things up over time. Anybody can pick these things up. They're not really... I'm not quite so married to those. They're not quite so specialized. They're the sorts of conversations you might have in a pub or just chatting with friends. So I'm a little bit more open to them. Hello, Fred Huber. Fred Huber is a patron. Thank you for being here. And yes, maybe a bit late, but that's all right. Lack of proficiency penalty. If they can have a role at all when they don't have the applicable training. Yeah, and I think there was something to be said for if you're not trained in certain things, you just can't do them because it's too complicated. It requires specialized training to even have any idea how to do it successfully. There are cases where I tell a player, your PC never had an opportunity to gain that knowledge. Yep, and I think that's fine, compared to just opening the smorgasbord to all skills. Anybody can make any skill check or ability check no matter what. I'm just not open for that. I feel like there do need to be some restrictions, not as maybe as restrictive as some people might think, but there are some certain things that just don't make sense to me. And my home group's been quite happy to do it that way. If anything, most of the people in my group are dungeon masters, and they've been saying, like, it doesn't make sense that you can make a knowledge check on something that you've never had any kind of training that's so specialized. Hello, Overboard. Hello, Joe. Overboard is a patron and a moderator. Thank you for being here. Okay, let's go on to something else because I've kind of talked to death a little bit about that. So I've still got a few things that I do that are around the basic rules and house rules that I run at my table. But I thought what I would do is I would present some of the reasons why I do certain things at my table. And one of the things that always seems to come up is character death. Character death at the table for me has always been really, really confusing for many, many years, until finally I decided that the best way to deal with character death was not to deal with character death. And I know that sounds bizarre and strange, but honestly, it's kind of freed me. There's nothing more frustrating than watching people either on the internet, on YouTube, or in person explain and argue the point and merits of when somebody has a character die, that they should have to make a new character when we were playing in a fantasy world. And that was only one aspect of my problems with this. So let me tell you what I do, and then I will explain why I do it that way. So there, or 10. Okay, so this is what I do with my characters when they die. And actually, I think I might just flick over to the screen because it's going to be more fun. It's more fun for me. Anyway, okay, so down we go. The fighter just got killed by the Dracolich. How sad. Never mind, right? But here's the thing. Whether you're using death saving throws or you're not using death saving throws, I still use death saving throws in my game. But one of the things I've discovered when it comes to character death is I don't want to be a part of that for a lot of different reasons. I still don't see there being any reason why the players can't simply make a decision about whether their character continues or not. So let me explain how I do this, and then I will explain why I do it this way and why I've come to the conclusion this is the best way for me and my home group. First off, Dracolich kills the fighter. They're down. They're dead. They're not dying. They are dead. They definitely got killed. And I have a really simple approach to using this. I ask my player, whoever belongs to that character, I say, you're playing this character, what do you want to do now that your character's dead? And I will ask that question, obviously, at the end of the combat when it's all resolved. And I'll say, do you want to make a new character? Do you want to bring the character back using magic? Quite often in my home group, the desire is that people start chanting reincarnate, reincarnate, particularly if the spell is available in the group. And they'll select reincarnate over raise dead almost every single time at my table, just because they want to see the character come back as some bizarre race. It's, I guess, one of the odd features of my home group. And then I'll also ask them, look, if you don't have magic and you don't want to make a new character and you want to play the same character, well, I can create a reason why the character can continue and come back into play. And I do this a lot of different ways. So they could come back as a ghost, a werewolf, a vampire, a pile of animated shit. I've done everything you can possibly imagine to a player character to bring them back. They've come back as angels, all sorts of things, when they have no other way through their party resources to bring them back. And there's a reason why I do this. And there are many reasons why I do this. And I will never go back to doing it the other way, because I was classically trained by other game masters that when a character dies, if they can't bring them back by magic because they don't have the resources to do so, to resurrect them, then they must make a new character. That is what I was trained to do by all the dungeon masters and game masters before me who I played with. And there is a couple of reasons why I've found that this doesn't work for me. First off, it always seems to, but not always, but it always seems to, at some point in the gaming history, somebody gets upset because they lost the character. And having to deal with people getting upset and crying and getting frustrated and angry that their character died, because player characters don't always die for a really good reason. Sometimes they just die for a fact that they rolled a 1 or a 2 too many times and I rolled really high, which doesn't happen very often. Or, I mean, sometimes it can be because they made bad choices. But even if they made bad choices, what the hell does that have to do with it, frankly? You know, we don't come to to play D&D to feel like garbage. We come to have a good time. And ultimately, just like when my monsters die, okay, I don't really, when I think about when my monsters die, I don't get upset because my monsters die, because there's more monsters. I can bring more monsters on. Do you know what I mean? It takes a long time to make a 5e character too. It's not like older versions of the game where you could make a character really quickly. Hypnotic, hello, how are you? I think we're all doing pretty well so far. Fred, Huber, and Andrew, I'll get to your comments in section. I just want to finish my train of thought before I go to the comments section. So give me a second. Okay. So because I don't want to get tied into that, another thing too is I was playing with my nephew. He was playing in a game. I was the dungeon master, and his character died. Now, the actions he took are sort of indicative of somebody who's new to D&D. You know, made a bad choice, didn't go the way he wanted it, and so he made a new character because that's what I told him he had to do. That's how I'd been trained. You make a new character, you can't bring it back. Your character's only level 3, you have to bring a new character in. So he made exactly the same character. It was identical, even the name. The only thing that was really slightly different, and this made me laugh so much, is he put number 2 beside it. That's it. And I said, well, hang on, you just made exactly the same character. And he said, yes, because I like playing this character, Fred, and I want to keep playing it. And I was like, okay. And I was thinking there, and I was thinking, what is the value in me yelling and shouting and telling him, no, you can't play D&D because you made exactly the same character? It taught me a very, very valuable lesson from a child of all things, because he was young, that I was too hung up on the fact that when a character died, they had to have a new character come in. And so I came up with a reason why his character came back, and that actually really helped me get over all of this nonsense. It's not the first time these sorts of things have happened to me. It's happened to me a couple of times, and each time it's happened to me, I was like, oh, right. I still hadn't figured that one out, had I? You know, I suppose I could have kicked them out of my game, but like, you're going to kick your nephew out of a game because he decided he wanted to play exactly the same character. So, yeah, I don't want to be a very petty kind of game master or dungeon master. One of the things I do stipulate, though, is, you know, that if they can't bring the character back themselves, that I usually give them 3 options, and there's usually a complication when I bring a character back, and it's me, there's the game master, trying to bring it back into the game. I'll give them a complication they can work off. So there is some sort of penalty, and sometimes the penalties that I put in place are rather amusing and also cause problems for the person playing the character. This is not always popular by all the players, but I do it. You know, losing an arm or a leg is something, but getting an arm and a leg back in a fantasy adventure is certainly possible. You know, it doesn't have to be a prosthetic limb. Things can be grown back. It's magic. And and I would send them off on some sort of quest to sort of correct the complication, or they'd have to do something that would change how everything worked out. And I don't have to worry about people crying at my table. I've seen adults crying at the table when their characters died. I don't want to do that. I don't have to deal with that. You know, and I'm not the sort of person who's like, oh, I'm going to kick somebody out of my game because they cried at my table because their character died. That's just not me. Okay. My training is in psychology, philosophy, mathematics. I have a counseling certificate. I work in the human services sector with people with mental illness. That's not how I'm built. So I just, and it alleviated. I don't have to worry about it. I don't care now if a character dies. I don't care if there's a total party kill, because as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't matter. The players will tell me what they want to do. They'll tell me whether they want to continue with the same characters or start with fresh characters. It made life so much easier as a game master to interact with my players when I did that. So yeah, that's why I do it, and I'm never going back. All right, Fred Huber, what do you got here? We used to take a point of con for each time the PC had to be raised from dead or resurrected. Okay. I mean, I do remember somebody saying, oh, when a character comes back into the party and they die, they're going to be one level lower than everybody else. Um, and what I've discovered is that can be a spiral downward. We had this in play one time. I think we were about level 5 or 6, and we got to a point in the adventure where things were really getting quite difficult. Everything that we were facing was flying, it was invisible while it was flying, and casting spells, and we just could not nail anything down. You know, it was so hard. And so we had this downward spiral where somebody would die, they would come back into the party, and there would be one lower level lower than everybody else. And because the party overall was now weaker and we were still trying to move forward, somebody else would die, and eventually a group that started at about level 5 or 6 wound up at about level 1 or 2, because every time we died we went back another level. I just don't do that anymore. When somebody dies in my game, they come back as exactly the same level as everybody else. I level everybody up at exactly the same rate. I don't have everybody. I used to sort of have people, leveling up at different rates depending on how much effort they put into the game, how well they played the game, how well they role played, how often they showed up. I don't even bother with any of that now. I just level everybody up at exactly the same rate, and I never have anybody coming back into the game at a lower level. But taking a point of con away, there's nothing wrong with doing that. That's how you do that, or did that, Fred Huber, in your games, and that's fine. For me, I still find that by using the system that I have in place, people do understand consequences. They still do understand consequences. Anyway, next, Andrew. For critical hits, I have used a double dice, but sometimes with bad luck, everything felt wrong. Why a critical ended with just 2 or 3 hit points? Yeah, I totally understand where you're going with this. I might actually talk to you about what I do with critical hits too. Actually, I probably shouldn't I? So I have changed it to add the maximum of the dice of a die plus a regular damage die roll. So you know that a critical hit will always have a reasonable base damage. Yeah, I've heard a lot of people doing this, and it's not a dumb idea. It's actually quite smart. There's another way you can do it as well, which is the way I do it. The dice given and the dice taketh away. Yeah, but I don't play. The honest truth is, I don't play role-playing games for the game mechanics or the rules, and I play games because ultimately what I really would like to have the greatest effect is really good choices and really well planned out actions. And if the game rules or the dice get in the way of that, I think that the game rules or the dice need to change the way they operate. And that's why I change the way I do my stuff. We used to also age out PCs by rolling for time passing between adventures, and might be hours, days, months, years, centuries. Yeah, a lot of people don't include downtime or spaces between their adventures. Everything is just a running fight to the very end, and within the space of a couple of weeks, you've gone from level 1 to level 20. I do understand that one because I've encountered it a lot. There's another thing that I do, and I don't know if people will necessarily agree with it, but critical hits. Let me explain this one. Just critical hits. Okay, so let's go this, and there's max. Okay. Okay, let's switch over, and I'll show you the screen here, and I'll give you an example of how I do my critical hit. So for me, when it comes to a critical hit, and we're doing anything that generates a lot of damage or causes a lot of injuries or anything like that, I'm always of the opinion that if we can give players an option to take a risk or go for sort of flat maths, like flat maths is actually really, really useful sometimes, and it's a lot more preferred as an option, right? So this is how I do it. when you get a critical hit, so you roll a 20, you get a critical hit on the Dracolich with your dwarf. Okay, critical hit by the dwarf on the Dracolich, and normally what you would do is you would add whatever your modifier is for your attack. So maybe let's say that it's a 1, and then you would roll, instead of just one of your damage dice, you'd roll 2 damage dice. And then you'd add those numbers together, and that is how much damage you're doing on a critical hit. Well, I decided to use the 4E version of how this works. I give the players the option. They can choose every single time they critical hit how it works. They can go with roll double the dice for the critical hit, or don't roll double the dice, but simply take the maximum value you can get on one single dice and add that to whatever your modifier is for your attack damage. And that's it. And this comes from 4E. This means that you can always be guaranteed that you will get a reasonable amount of regular, reliable damage off a critical hit. And it doesn't sort of make it stronger than it was before. Because one of the things I've found that is if I give them maximum damage on one dice and allow them to roll another dice as well, then on average the damage they do is greater with a critical hit. And that's not so much of a big issue if the players are hitting monsters, but it's a big deal if the monsters get a critical hit and suddenly they have to deal with maximum damage off the damage dice, and I'm rolling another dice as well. It can be very, very painful, particularly at low level. No, not so much at mid-level or higher levels, but at low levels, level 1, 2, and 3, it's going to be pretty brutal. There's going to be a lot of character death. And yeah, I don't necessarily roll a lot of 20s, but I've found that that's part of the problem. And I don't think that, that's an issue for most people, because I'm sure that people adjust how many hit points their monsters have, and maybe they boost the players' hit points as well, things like that. And you can always say, you know, if the rule applies to the player characters, it should apply to the monsters as well, and you just live with the consequences, which is fine. But I found that was a nice, easy fix. So if you have a choice between rolling 2 dice and taking just the maximum damage off 1 dice, I found that my players will always go for take the big risk and roll 2 dice. And they don't feel that bad if they roll really badly, because I did give them the option before they rolled the 2 dice to just take maximum damage off the one dice that they had for their attack. So even though players don't use it that much, yeah, the outcome is simply alleviated a lot of the it's just too risky. I don't want to roll 2 1s or snake eyes or 2 2s and get really like below average damage for the attack. That would just suck. So yeah, so that's always an option at my table if people want to use it. Will I change the way that works in the future? Probably not. If anything, I've almost felt like doing additional damage and making a 20. I mean, making a 20 an automatic hit in the first place is a big deal, right? Any time you roll a 20 and you get automatic success, since that would happen at my table, that's a big deal. So it doesn't need to really have additional damage as well. It would be nice. It would certainly make it special. But then it sort of begs the question, why don't we do something like that? You know, when you roll a 20, why aren't we getting critical success on an ability check, a skill check, a saving throw? And the problem is how do you implement it? You'd have to figure out some way of making that work. And I think in some cases Pathfinder 2nd Edition has sort of achieved that, but not for everything. Anyway. Another crit hit option is max damage, which is close to average for rolling double the dice. Yeah, that's what I use, Fred Huber. Yeah, that's why I do it that way. So you get rid of the risk factor. I did try giving the enemies death saves. It was a pain in the tail, I bet. and it had the PCs always doing extra attack after the enemy fell for the death saving. Yeah, I bet, because you're going to have players who are like, make sure it stays down, and they're whacking away at it for sure. All right, so another rule that I've applied to my game that I use a lot is a house rule, and and that is the following. I allow my players to retrain their characters before a game or after a game session, and they can do that as many times as they like. What they can't change on their character sheet is the name of the character or the gear that they are carrying and how much gold they have. So the name of the character and the gear and the money that they have doesn't change, but they can change their race, they can change their class, they can change their backgrounds, they can change their feats, as long as they're doing it before the game or after the game, and they let me know about the fact that they're going to do that. I'm fine with that. So why do I allow such a flexible retraining system in my home game? Well, one of the reasons for doing so is that most of the people in my group, let me get a bit closer here. So one of the reasons why I do the retraining that way is most of the people in my group are power gamers. They've been playing the game a long time, so I would say that they are mature power gamers. They don't just approach the game by min-maxing and power gaming. They do that, but they also like story, they like role-playing, they like the other aspects of the game, they like exploration. But there are so many options, there are so many different supplements out there for 5e, and it wasn't so bad when we started out because we only had the player's handbook. But as Wizards of the Coast and third-party publishers produced more and more content, it became more and more difficult to sort of stave off the desire to try new things. And one of the things that you may have discovered, if you have power gamers or people who like min-maxing and optimizing in your game, is when a new toy comes along, they want to try it out. They're always trying to think about, like, what would it be like if I tried this combination? And so I had this problem that would occur in my game, and that is when I didn't allow retraining, I would have players who were wanting to try something new commit suicide, and they wouldn't inform the rest of the party that they were going to try and commit suicide, so they didn't have to play this character anymore. And they were going to go off in a bang. They were going to sacrifice themselves. So everybody else would be trying to save this player's character who's about to commit suicide so they can bring in a new character. And then the whole party would get wiped out because they didn't leave them to die because they were doing something that was supposed to be brave or foolish or dangerous or stupid or silly or whatever. Occasionally I would have players who would say, I'm kind of sick and tired of this character. I would just like to play a new character because of this new feature that's available in this book or whatever. And that's really helpful because okay, I understand where you're going with this. Okay, and I could just say yes or no. Now, the problem is if I said yes, we're all good. If I said no, then suddenly the suicidal character would rear its head. They would try to get rid of their character so they could bring in a new character. And the other thing is, sometimes when you're building a character for 5e or any game system that's got a lot of complexity and feats and stuff like that, you'll make mistakes, or you discover that some combinations some things didn't work out quite the way you were hoping, and it didn't do as much as you were expecting. It wasn't quite as useful, and there was something that you could have done that was better. Sometimes people just make mistakes or overestimate the value of how they built their character. Because a lot of 5e characters are very mechanical. They're quite complicated too. And so, sometimes you're like, I made a mistake, and I don't like that combination. I hardly use that feature. I'd like something else. So by suddenly eliminating that problem, you might be saying, well, hang on though, what happens in your group? Do they constantly change their character? Are they constantly retraining their character? No, they don't. Actually, maybe initially you might see a couple of changes, 2 or 3 changes initially, and then after that it just stops. I found my group don't constantly, week by week by week, alter the way their character works in terms of race and class and all that sort of stuff. They get to a sort of a happy medium, and then it all becomes sort of a lot more stable, and it eliminates that suicidal character that causes so many problems. Character death and a TPK is not a big issue for me, but for other people in the group, the other players in the group, when that happens, it's frustrating. Even though they know how I deal with character death, it's still a little bit frustrating. They're like, if we had known you were going to commit suicide, we would have just left you to die. But you didn't say anything before the game. If we had known you wanted to play a new character, why don't you just ask him to... Yeah, so I've been down that. So that's why I have retraining in my game, and why I make it available anytime, as long as it's before the game or after the game session, and that's it. Okay. Now there's another system that you're probably very familiar with, and that is inspiration. Now the problem with inspiration in 5e is its standard application is shit. It's really, really shit. I can't stand the fact that inspiration in 5e works the way that it does. So this is how I approach inspiration in my game. And I've found this to be really, really successful. It's made a huge difference in terms of how the game plays. And I don't know why I didn't try to do it this way early on. And it's not my idea. It actually comes from one of my buddies, Simon. I would say Simon is the one who really helped develop that idea so that it really works well. I'm going to jump over here for a second. So inspiration basically means you get advantage on a dice roll when you need to use it, right? Or when you want to use it in 5e. And to get that, you have to usually play to one of your flaws. By playing to one of your flaws, which means that you wind up doing something that will disadvantage you, or give you, a suboptimal option or action or whatever, that you would be awarded this inspiration. Now, you have to use it during the session. You can't bank it in 5e, that sort of stuff. And I found that it just didn't do enough. One of the biggest problems with having advantage, even though essentially it means that you're getting like a +5 to your roll, is the way that it works. One of the biggest problems I've found is inspiration doesn't get used for a variety of different reasons. So this is what I do. If the player who's playing a character does something that's risky, or is playing to a flaw that would disadvantage them in some way, and there would be a dice roll, a 20-sided dice roll involved to achieve some sort of success or failure with the action they're trying to perform, I will award them inspiration so that the chances of doing that foolish, risky, or quite often fun and entertaining action or task improves. So if the fighter decides that they are going to try to jump onto our Dracolich and stab it or hack away at it with an axe. It's not a great example, but say they're trying to do that. I would give them, okay, so to jump onto here, I'm going to give you inspiration. So I want you to have a better chance than normal of being successful, because it's probably going to be quite difficult. It's quite a big creature, right? You get inspiration on that roll. And what sort of roll will it be? It can be an acrobatics check. It could be a strength check, a dexterity check, or maybe an athletics or an acrobatics check. Any one of those. Acrobatics, athletics, dexterity, strength. One of those. I don't mind. It's all good. Cool. So you get a better chance of succeeding. What it does is it means they can't bank it. You only use it when I award it for the particular action where the dice roll is involved. That's how I use my inspiration. And that's the only way that I use inspiration. And I've found it to be ultimately far more successful. Now, there's a couple of reasons why I do this. First off, by doing it this way, one, banking, they won't forget about it. Banking means that as soon as you start banking inspiration, then there's the desire to bank more than one inspiration. If they get inspiration assigned to them and they can bank it, and it's only 15 minutes before you end the session, then of course by going by the 5e rules you would lose that inspiration because you never used it during that game session. You could say, of course, okay, you can keep it till next time, but again, the whole point behind inspiration is you use it essentially straight away, like for that session. Yes, it absolutely removes the player's decision about when to use it, but I often find that it doesn't make sense to give somebody inspiration on a dice roll when it's not related to the action they were going to try to perform, and there's dice rolls involved. I might even say, okay, you can jump onto the Dracolich, but with your attack, because this is kind of cool and quite risky, I'm going to give you advantage on your first attack. So you've got a better chance of actually succeeding and actually making that attack hit. One of the biggest problems I found with inspiration in 5e, and this is why I do it this way now, is one, players do forget that they have inspiration, particularly if they are banking it. Two, because player characters in 5e are so powerful and my group are so good at playing the game now, they often won't use inspiration to get advantage because they often don't feel like they need it. They're doing perfectly fine, that there's no great risk to them because they're taking the most sensible route. And another aspect is when you have a situation like that occurring and your inspiration is based off, you can assign it to whatever dice roll, they don't take quite so many risks. By operating the way that I do now, by assigning it to when you perform a risky or difficult task, and I can give you advantage on that dice roll if there's a dice roll involved or a check involved. Well, the great thing about it is they will take more risks and do more things that actually make the whole game session more fun, entertaining, and kind of really crazy, frankly. So, yeah, and you don't have to worry about people, sort of forgetting. There's another thing I do too with the inspiration is it's not just I can give them inspiration on their dice roll. If they're doing something dangerous and another party member is involved in the task and that party member might have disadvantage, then I can take away the disadvantage so they just have a flat roll. Or I can give another party member advantage if that would assist in whatever dangerous task this person's trying to perform, whichever thing they would prefer. So there's a lot more flexibility. I can even, in some cases, remove or apply disadvantage to the enemy when the players are trying to do something dangerous against them, to make it a bit more difficult for the enemy or the monsters to stop them trying to perform that risky task. And so therefore there's a few more things going on there. One of the things we've always also played around with is, instead of rolling for advantage when we have inspiration, just rolling a 10-sided dice and adding the result of the 10-sided dice to the 20-sided dice. So you have an additional number being added to whatever you roll on your 20-sided dice. That can be quite satisfying. Often that can be placed like in the middle of the table. We've done that. I don't use that quite so much nowadays. And I think primarily the only reason is if I was playing in person, I probably would do it that way. But because we don't play in person, it doesn't make any sense. Because you really have to have like a little plate in the middle of the table with the D10s there, and then anybody can pluck them from the group when they want to use it. But on a Zoom call, it doesn't really work very well. So yeah, it's best to work the way that I described it a second ago. Apply it to the dice roll or the check right then and there. I've seen players hoard their inspiration like spell scrolls. I've only got this one. I might need it more and need more in the next encounter. Exactly. And the scroll I gave the party first session of the campaign is still in someone's backpack at the end of the campaign. Yeah, that's another thing, is that like as soon as we started having a banking system with inspiration, suddenly people had 4 or 5 inspiration points. And like, when are you going to use those? Oh, not yet. I'm waiting for a really bad problem where I really need to use it. And I'm like, okay. So that's part of the reason why I make inspiration dice rolls much more immediate. Okay, next. It's top of the hour at this present time, And I think maybe I'm going to take just a 5 minute break, come back, and then I'll continue. I know this is a little bit different to what people were expecting today. Oh, here we go. Cool Keg Computer. I haven't seen Cool Keg Computer for a long time. I still have inspiration points from last year. Oh my gosh. See, there's the problem, right? Inspiration points that you've stacked and hoarded and banked from last year. That is nuts. Yeah. That is so funny. That's part of the reason why I did it. I think one of the biggest reasons why in my group I knew I had to do it differently is my group would constantly not be using inspiration because they just found everything too easy. They're like, oh, I think we can handle this. And I can tell you, man, I'm about to tell you how I crank up my game, and you'll probably be a bit shocked, but we'll see how that goes in a second. I'm going to go and take a 5 minute break, but I'm going to just type something into the chat first. Hashtag share. What house rules you use? Game or other ones. Right. Yeah, I'll use it next time I roll a 1, and then you just don't roll a 1 for like a year. Anyway, I'm going to be back. Give me 5 minutes just to go and use the toilet, and then I'll chat about some of the other things that I do, because I've still got a few things on my list. Okay, there we go. Right. Okay, I'm back. Let's have a look and see what people had to say, and then I will go into the rest of the things that I have here on my little list of things that I do. I still use the AD&D rule of Fireball. Will take up 36,000 cubic feet. Okay, 10 by 10 by 10 squares. Okay, all right. If the ceiling is 10 feet high, and we'll blow out the weakest door if necessary to do this. Interesting. Okay, so here's one of the things that I've come across. We don't wind up with this problem coming up that much, but one of the things you might have noticed in 5e, when you need to do anything that requires a lot of strength, like you're trying to push a door open or move a rock or shift something, lift something, I've quite often heard from a lot of game masters, well, that's a strength check. That's an ability check, a strength check. And then players will ask, can I make an athletics check? And I've heard a few, I mean, maybe this is just how people are running the game, but I get the impression that Wizards of the Coast does this as well. and they'll state, oh no, it's just a straight strength check. And of course, you're not proficient in this, you're not trained in this, you can't be trained in lifting. And I've always disagreed with that. So this is how I do any kind of thing that involves strength, where you have to push something, pull something, lift something, pull something out of somewhere. I will allow a strength check, okay? Or like I said, I'll use strength score first, or I'll use a strength check if their strength score is not high enough to just succeed without rolling dice. But I'll also allow for an athletics check if they would prefer, particularly if they are proficient. Now, my rationale for why I do that is the following. When you do any kind of athletics-like training, part of your athletic-like training is strength training. And one of the first things you get taught with pretty much everything is how to lift correctly and safely. It's one of the first things I had to teach people when they were working in the workshop making furniture. So whatever activity you're doing, learning to lift correctly means you can lift more and safely. Yep, that's actually a skill. It's not just, oh, you're just using raw muscle. There's actually technique behind it. So I've always viewed the use of athletics or strength as totally acceptable. So when somebody wants to do that sort of thing, they can use a strength check or they can go with the athletics check. And I'm quite happy to just go with that. So I've done that quite a lot in my games, and I don't think I'll ever change it. Just because I've done weight training, and I know that if you do weight training, you have to learn how to lift correctly and properly, otherwise you hurt yourself. And even when you were, training for something else, there's usually strength training involved, which means, using your back in some way and lifting a heavy weight to increase the muscle size of your body. So yeah, I always consider it a trainable skill, lifting. Okay, now let's have a look at some of the other things that I do. And this is probably more around monsters. And then I'm going to talk about some of the things I haven't put into place, but I probably will be in the future. So I thought that would be an interesting sort of discussion point as well. So what I will do is I will just grab that, grab this. And I think I'm just about ready there. Yep, I think I'm just about ready. Cool. All right, let's switch it over, and I'll just take you over to this screen. Where is it? So one of the first things that I tend to find is anything that can reduce the number of dice rolls that I do as a game master is a good thing. So if I am attacking with my skeletons here, I will use average damage. All the monsters on their stat blocks have an average damage value. So I will always use average damage, okay? If I'm playing with a group of people who are very new, then I will just use the average damage. But my own home group, I know they can take it, and so I will use average damage for every hit that they make, and I will roll a 6-sided dice as well and add that to the average damage. Because monsters in 5e for my home group do not do enough damage to be successful. And in fact, right now I'm looking to upgrade my 6-sided dice that I roll with my average damage to an 8-sided dice, because maybe even a 10-sided dice, because I think the players in my group can handle it. I'm also very open to my players using average damage on their dice rolls, particularly at high level, so there's less dice rolling. I'm happy for them to roll physical dice or digital dice on their phone for the attacks and saving throws. That's all good as far as I'm concerned. Attack rolls make sense, great. But the problem is, particularly at high level, and just because there are so many dice to roll in 5e sometimes, I would like them to just use a digital process. If they can't use a digital process, then average damage coming off even the player characters is fine with me. I know I've had this discussion with a few of them where they say, well, can we round up rather than round down? I said, no, because the monsters don't round up. They round down when they're doing average damage as well. So no, we won't be doing that. Particularly at high level. At level 10, it really starts to get really cumbersome. And that's the most frustrating time because there's so many dice being rolled. So I'm always sort of a strong proponent for average damage with the monsters and even the player characters. just because it's just a speed thing, you know. Again, I know that's a thing that people like doing. People like rolling dice. But anything to keep combat moving fast and swift and exciting. And I do not like combat that takes 20 minutes or 30 minutes, even 15 minutes, and I'm starting to get bored. I want it fast, brutal, and interesting. And the only way to do that is to really clock things up. And I found this works pretty good because, you know, from about level 1 to 3, player characters, their characters are a lot more fragile. But after that, once we get to about level 5 onward, it's very hard to knock a character down, even kill a character, unless you make a lot of adjustments to 5e. So this is one of the reasons why I use average damage and then I roll a 6-sided dice, speed up play. And, you know, when you're a game master, you might have quite a few things you have to control. It just speeds up that process so I don't have to think quite so much as well. Okay, raise dead. A willing spirit, I tell the player the PC is before their deity and describe their afterlife situation. Your comrades are calling. You can return, but it might change your afterlife. Well, I suppose it could. Absolutely. So that's one thing that I do with my monsters. Another thing that I do with my monsters, and that is legendary actions. Legendary actions are a really big important thing, particularly for solo creatures or monsters on their own, or monsters that are supposed to be really impressive. And I've found that this has worked almost perfectly in every circumstance. The experience has always been much more interesting, and that is the following. We have a legendary creature here with legendary actions, a Dracolich. Okay? So at the end of every single player's turn, I will have some sort of legendary action that my Dracolich or legendary monster will perform. So that it means that even though it's got its own turn, we're never waiting for 4 or 5 or 6 players to have their turn before the Dracolich can finally do something. I've always found that having only 3 legendary actions in 5e is simply not enough. Certainly not for my group. So I have ensured that if my group consists of 4 players, then there are 4 legendary actions that we can take. If there are 5 or 6 players, then we'll have 5 or 6 legendary actions that will take place. But not only that, I expand the number of things that a legendary action can be. All of the standard actions, I include those as well. They are also things that my Dracolich would be able to perform, such as dodge, disengage, dash, hide, help. All those things are there and available to it, so that there's a lot more stuff that it can do, and also basic attacks if that has not been included in the legendary actions. So the only time I don't include something as part of its main attacks is if it's a special recharging feature. If there's a recharge on it, I would not make that a legendary action because that will probably be way too strong. And I found that to be just change the way legendary monsters work in my game. It means it compensates for the party size. I don't have to worry about if I have a group of 7 players. I don't have to worry about if I have just a group of 3 players, because if you have a group of 2 players and suddenly they're dealing with a legendary creature and the monster has 3 legendary actions, that's pretty brutal. It's pretty brutal. And I don't usually throw a legendary creature against 3 players, because they just don't have enough numbers, even if I were to do it. So yeah, you almost find that I will always stall and postpone the use of a legendary creature when there's only 3 players, because you only really need to have one person go down on their face and there's only 2 people left to try to keep everything moving, and that can be quite difficult sometimes. But it's really, really useful when you're dealing with a group of 4, 5 or 6 or 7 players. And even if you've got a group of 10 players, your legendary creature compensates for that. It means that for those 1 or 2 rounds, and most fights only go from 1 to 3 rounds, and with a legendary creature, it's quite common, even if you give them maximum hit points, and I do that every single time, all my monsters have maximum hit points. I always find that a legendary creature really will only last between 1.5 to 2 rounds. So if I'm able to have it do something cool and interesting after everybody's turn, then it just makes the fight far more dynamic and far more threatening. I burn through a lot more resources too. I don't have to worry about my players being fully equipped. You know, if they've had a long rest and they go into the last fight, it's not a problem because my monster can handle it. You know what I mean? Anyway, what else we got here? I change up the spells of a beholder using the center eye as anti-magic, sometimes anti-gravity, or one eye stalk might be sleep or magic missile at a level. Okay. Just about any spell swap a similar level. So yes, I swap out a lot of my spells for my my spell casters too. I usually include shield if they don't have shield. I usually include counterspell if they don't have counterspell. If there are spells there that the players would normally take that would give them a huge advantage, I make sure my enemies have them as well. Otherwise, it's just not that much fun. Okay, so now I thought what I would do is I would discuss some of the things that I am likely to put into my game that aren't house rules yet, but will likely be in the future. And I'll probably explain. I'm going to explain why I'm going to do this. So the first one, the really big one, is close quarter combat or melee combat, for example. Normally you have weapons that can only be used, you know, you get to use either strength or dexterity as the ability modifier as part of that attack roll, right? Along with proficiency. Some you can only use strength when it comes to melee. But for me, I've always found that dexterity, your speed, coordination, and how fast you move and how agile you are is just as important as strength, okay, to actually hit a target when you're using a melee weapon. Whether you're punching somebody, using a sword or some sort of weapon, I've always found that it's a combination of strength and dexterity, not just one or the other. And because most military weapons that are melee weapons are designed to be balanced, I'm going to answer your question, call Keg Computer. And you don't need to worry about your question not being to theme. I will answer your question for sure. Just let me finish this line of thought. Because it involves both dexterity and strength, and most weapons are balanced, even a broadsword is balanced. They don't actually weigh that much, and when you hold them, they feel a lot lighter than you would expect. The only weapons that are potentially problematic in terms of weight when you're dealing with a melee attack is a maul, or something that has got a great huge weight on one end, where, you know, the throwing hammer in the Olympics is another one of those things where you really need a lot of physical strength to hold on to it to build up a momentum. But things like the rapier, the dagger, the long sword, broadswords, heck, even a trident or a staff, all those things, you know, really are a combination. So I am quite happy, and this is what I'll probably do, is for somebody to use either one. I don't care. They can use the strength or the dexterity. It doesn't need to be a finesse weapon for me. Okay, because ultimately there's only a handful, less than a handful, maybe 3 weapons that really are strength-based, where you're really having to be quite strong to use them. And even in those cases, I would still say you could use either one, but maybe there's a restriction on if you use a maul, you have to have a strength of at least 13 as your score to be able to lift it up and move it around in a reasonable manner. Do you know what I mean? That's probably one of the things that I'm putting important to my game. Now, I know a lot of people are thinking, well, that just makes dexterity better than, you know, having a strength score. But here's the thing. When I did a lot of martial arts, and one of the first things I discovered when I was doing unarmed attacks and using weapons is that when somebody comes in and they're really strong, you train them to focus on using their strength rather than their speed, but you train them to get quicker and faster. But that will never be their their best attribute. A person who is quite large and got a lot of muscle power, their strength is their greatest advantage. So you need them to capitalize on that, okay? Whether you're using a weapon or you're going unarmed. And then when we had people come in who were children and women, and they would try to use raw power and strength, we're like, you can't fight that way. You will lose. So we would train them to capitalize on what they were good at. They were quick, they were fast, okay? And we just need to get their coordination up to snuff. We would still train them to get stronger because that's always part and parcel, but their strength was never going to be their greatest aspect. And yet they used the same weapons as everybody else when we did weapon training. And I saw plenty of people who were weaker than somebody else using melee weapons, staffs, nunchucks, swords, and so forth, who did far better than somebody who was strong. So strength is really not the most important aspect when fighting in melee. If I had a choice between strength and speed, I would always go with speed. Why? Because blades have a sharp edge, and you don't have to hit very hard with a sharp edge to kill somebody. It's as simple as that. So this is one of those things with melee attacks that I'm definitely probably going to import. Right, cool care computer. Let's get to your question. Fred, quick question. My DM is actually a girl I really like, and her birthday is coming up. Any ideas for cool and useful D&D based gifts? Why don't you just ask her? Cool care computer. Just ask her. Just ask your... Look, I always found it's much smarter just to ask your game master or dungeon master what things they really could do with. And they will just tell you. And then produce it. I have no idea what this lady has in terms of equipment. So I really can't give you an answer to that. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? Okay. All right. All right. Fred Huber, what do you got here? A book they have mentioned, wishing they had a nice dice set. A really nice homemade dice tower. Yeah, dice towers get in the way. I find that if I could not handle, even if I was playing in person, a dice tower would just annoy me. It would just be a pain. A box of creature figures. Yeah, if your game master uses miniatures, you can really probably never go wrong by getting monster creature miniatures. What is it? There's some really good silicon battle mats out there, and they last like forever. You can use any kind of pen marker on them, and you can usually get it off with a bit of a wet wipe with some Dettol on it, or a bit of soap and water, and it just comes off. It doesn't matter how long you leave it there, just because of the way that silicon reacts to markers, permanent and everything else. I found a set of 6 double-sided or various terrain. Okay, yep. I like making a Dex Paladin with just enough strength for chainmail. Yeah, so one of the factors is, you think about a fighter, even if you allow them to pick dexterity or strength for making, these melee attacks, there's still got to be a restriction when you're wearing armor, because if you're not strong enough to wear the armor, then you won't be wearing the armor, will you? And of course, if you're in the front line and making attacks up close, you need to be armored, otherwise you're probably going to die pretty quickly. So yeah, okay. Another thing that I'll probably be doing too, and I've had many discussions with my home group about, and that is ranged attacks. So whether that's with bows and arrows, crossbow, even casting spells at range that use an attack roll, particularly the attack roll. One of the first things you discover is that most weapons that are ranged weapons are quite complicated in how they operate. So first off, if you think about something like a short bow does not have a lot of strength required to draw back the bow. But you do have to be strong enough to hold and maintain it in position, plus there's coordination, which is dexterity. So there's an aspect of strength, not a lot, strength and dexterity to actually fire a bow to hit a target. The greatest part of it is not so much the dexterity or the strength, it's the training to do it so you know how to hit your mark. Do you know what I mean? And so I'm very much open to the idea that with ranged attacks, use dexterity or strength, either one. I don't care. Uh, and fundamentally, there's a couple of different reasons. I'm going to give you some examples why. So with a short bow, as I said, really training and being able to aim and hit that point, being able to draw it back far enough, there's strength. Being able to line it up, there's dexterity. When you look at a longbow, you need to be a lot stronger to draw back on a longbow because the tension on it is much greater. So there's actually quite a lot of strength required to use a longbow, yet we don't recognize that in D&D. Also, again, just like the short bow, dexterity and a lot of training to be able to hit your target is a big factor. So dexterity and strength are actually quite important, and I would say strength is even more important with a longbow than a short bow. So that's why I'm like, let's just use dexterity or strength. The next thing is a crossbow. Now, a crossbow that you have to pull back on that doesn't have a crank requires a lot of strength. You have to load it. Okay? Not only that, crossbows can be quite heavy in comparison to a longbow because they don't spread the weight. All the weight is positioned differently. The weight on a longbow or short bow is vertical, whereas with a crossbow, the weight is horizontal, which means you're using your shoulders and your back, your upper back a lot more. So it's actually much more difficult. You're actually using a lot of strength to position, and you're still using your dexterity because you've got to line things up, and there's a lot of training required to hit your mark. Yeah? Now, you might be thinking, okay, what about a crossbow that has a crank on it? Well, again, you eliminate some of the strength requirement because you don't have to draw back on the string for the crossbow by having a crank, yes. But it doesn't eliminate the horizontal force that you have to contend with to line it up, to make sure and hold in position. That's not dexterity, that's actually strength that you're dealing with. So, again, I look at that and I think, okay, that's another factor. If we think about the sling, which is a ranged weapon as well, really the speed at which you can swing the thing in a circle, okay, generates the distance you can fire your stone or your bullet for a sling. But ultimately, dexterity is probably more important than strength. Although, if you are strong, you can potentially swing it faster in a circle and generate more force to fire it further. But there's a lot of dexterity going on there, right? But it's more the training, knowing when to release it. Okay, so I would say it leans a bit more heavily into dexterity, but there is still a strength factor. You do still need to be strong enough to be able to swing it round and around and around. How much force is required to do that? Well, let's think about this. If you have a larger sling, okay, a throwing hammer is a good example of this. Like you can have a larger stone in there, which will do more damage, but you would have to be stronger to do that, okay? So it's the sort of weapon that you can, whether you're strong or whether you're fast or dexterous or you've got a lot of strength in your character, either one can play into it quite nicely. But I'd still lean more into the dexterity. But I don't think it's enough of a differentiation. There's both of them are involved. What's another weapon that's a good example? Here are the spear or the javelin that you throw. And we use strength as our modifier for throwing a javelin. One of the things I thought was interesting is when I was doing athletics, yes, being strong and throwing a javelin is important, but actually training, coordination, and dexterity is actually really important too. Even if you're not particularly strong, you can throw a javelin a long way as long as you understand your body kinetics, which is more on the training and dexterity aspect. Okay? And absolutely, by being stronger, you can throw it a little bit further, but you still are reliant on the dexterity aspect. So I feel like when you're throwing a weapon, even if it's a dagger, both are required. You still need to have strength. You still need to have dexterity to be successful, which is why I lean more into ranged attacks could potentially just be dex or strength and not worry about it. The only thing I think with ranged attacks that I would like to see removed is adding a modifier from your strength or your dexterity to ranged attacks, because you can only draw a short bow back so far to get a certain amount of force. You can only draw a long bow back so far to generate a certain amount of force. Drawing back the string on a long bow too far will simply break the string in the bow. You won't actually generate any more power as such. Yeah? And you certainly can't generate any more power with something like a crossbow. So I think adding like a modifier to damage on ranged attacks doesn't really make a lot of sense. Potentially with something like a sling, maybe with a javelin that you're throwing, but things like long bows, short bows, crossbows, it doesn't make sense, because they generally have a fixed pullback range and that's it. And I think we kind of forget these things along the way. What I was really interesting is that basic or back me Dungeons and Dragons does not have, when you make a projectile weapon attack or a ranged attack, you don't add any modifier. You just roll the damage dice and that's it. And I actually kind of like that way of approaching it. But when it comes to melee damage, I think that force can be generated by speed or by just muscle power. So it could be dexterity, could be strength. And there's very few weapons that really sort of require you to be particularly strong. Something like the great axe, the maul, the great sword, these things are quite a lot heavier. They are still relatively balanced because they're weapons of war and they're designed to be like that. Hello, how's it going? Country245, how are you doing? So those are sorts of aspects of the game that I will certainly be bringing into my game at some point. I don't know when, but I know that they're on the market. My group has talked about them a lot, and we're of the agreement that change is probably perfectly fine. How it will affect the game ultimately, I don't know, but I think it will actually be much, much more useful to us. Another thing that, for me, Dungeons and Dragons 5e that I can't stand, and I probably will change. I haven't changed it yet, but I'm definitely leading that way, is Vancian magic. I can't stand Vancian magic. I can't stand having spells that spells that you have to prepare, and then having spell slots. There's 3 different things going on. It's so complicated. It's such a pain in the ass. I can't stand it. It drives me nuts. I like the idea of having some limits to magic, but I also really like the idea of taking the game into the realm of danger. That magic is dangerous. So I will probably get rid of Vancian magic with my spell casting in my game at some point. It will just disappear, and there will be hazard tables. If you wind up failing a saving throw or an attack roll, there's something will go wrong. If you roll like a 1 on an attack roll for this, with you casting a spell, then you might lose the spell for the day, and you can't cast that spell for the day. Those are the sorts of things I like. I saw that being used in Shadow Dark, and the mishap tables for magic, and the fact that you could lose magic spells for like a day if you rolled a 1 on an attack roll. I thought those were really, really clever, and I liked them a lot. Country, I finished a Thanksgiving one-shot yesterday for the Thanksgiving holiday. Oh, did you? It involves cultists summoning a turkey dragon. The setting is a town called Gobbleton. Dear. I don't like the cleric having access to all of the spells of level, but wizard has to find them and get them in their spellbook. So, yeah, you're experimenting with ChatGPT, so I can take full credit. So here's thanks for sharing that, Country. So this is one of the things I do want to keep, though. I feel like a wizard should still have a spell book and have to learn spells. I still like that aspect of it, but it's the only one. Vancian magic, if anything, I feel like is the only class that makes sense to have it is the wizard. I don't think it works with the other classes. It just feels off. And I still like the idea that the wizard can cast magic and really stuff things up and have things go terribly wrong. So I like that a lot as a concept. Each should have to find and research spells. I think the flavor for a sorcerer should be different to a wizard, and I think the flavor for a warlock should be different to a sorcerer or a wizard, and I think the cleric casting spell should be different as well. One of the other things that I've really not been a fan of is any house rules you have involving multi-classing. So, Cool Keg Computer, I really hate multi-classing. My group does a lot of it. I can't stand it. I really don't like subclasses because I always see subclasses as an indication that the class itself, the overall class itself, is incomplete and not very good in 5e. And so I am not a fan of multiclassing. The problem with multiclassing is people multiclass at my table and in the games that I see in 5e, and I'm working towards making the higher levels much more impactful and much more desirable, so that you don't want to multiclass, because if you do multiclass you won't get those features. So making the level 20 capstone feature needs to be really good. It needs to be decent, because right now in 5e it sucks. I'm going to be actually doing this. I'm going over the Barbarian. I'm going to remaster the Barbarian tomorrow. Or start that process. It'll probably take me 2 days, but that'll be the first day is tomorrow. And then subclasses, again, they're just such a mess. Multiclassing is such a broken mess in 5e. Yeah, it is. It is a broken mess, because they've taken away so many of the restrictions that it's much more sensible, if you're playing the game, to multi-class than to not multi-class. This is one of the things that my players in my home group have made it quite clear. And when I play the game and I've multi-classed, it's made more sense to multi-class than not to multi-class. And yet it's an optional thing. What does that say? That says that the rules for multi-classing are too good. But it also says that the classes themselves, as they stand, are shit. They're not very good. And particularly at high level, because at high level they keep giving you combat features, and at high level you don't need combat features, you actually need other stuff to make the game really worth playing. Otherwise, this is why nobody plays beyond level 10, or very few people play beyond level 10. They're usually playing from level 1 to 10, and there's very few people who ever get to level 15 or 20 or anything like that. So yeah, I'm currently building the classes so that multi-classing does not look desirable. That keeping a pure class the way it is far more impactful and far more desirable, so that you're getting all of it that you want from it. Do you know what I mean? AD&D second edition multi-classing and characters with 2 class systems is better, but still not right. Yeah. Yeah. See, I guess let's think about this. Multi-classing exists, and so do subclasses, because Wizards of the Coast right now doesn't want to make full-blown classes. If we go back to something like version 3.5, there were a lot of different full-blown classes in 3.5. Even if we go back to AD&D, there were actually a lot of new classes, not subclasses, no multi-classing. It was just full-blown classes thought out from level 1 right through to level 10 or level 20 or whatever it was. Even Dungeons & Dragons 4e. So 3.5 did it, 4e did it, but Wizards of the Coast doesn't want to spend all the time and having to put them into the books, because a full-blown class takes up a lot of space in a book. It's also much easier to make just part of a class rather than a full-blown class. It's what I call lazy design. Multi-classing and, the rules for multi-classing and the rules for subclasses and how they work in 5e, it's just an indication that people don't want to put that much work into the whole process. because it takes a long time to make a full-blown class. It takes a lot of space up, and you have to think about a lot of different things, and it means you do have to think very carefully about how you play test it, and they don't want to do that. So that's why I've looked at the 12 classes and think what I want 12 classes that are very distinct from each other, that do exactly what you envisage them being able to do. And my players, I said, well, what about if we want to make variations? Well, I said, well, we need to just build in aspects to it so there are some choices that you make. But if you're playing a cleric, why not give the person all of the aspects of a cleric that makes sense, rather than split them up amongst all of these subclasses or require you to multi-class to get that stuff? Like, I just don't get it. So yes, I am customizing all of the classes for 5e, and they will look very, very different. They will look much more like parts of 5e, parts of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and parts of just what I think the class needed to do. Because I've had this discussion with my group. None of us have really been totally happy with all the classes that we've played throughout the years, no matter what version of the game we played. I've got a JP still pissed that he can't have a Griffin or a Pegasus if he's playing a Ranger at high level, because it's not built into the character class. It's something a game master would say, yeah, you can have that. So these are the sorts of things that, it makes no sense that our barbarian cannot just rage when they go into combat every single time. Why would you even be a barbarian and not be raging? It makes no sense to me whatsoever. It doesn't make any sense to anybody in my group as well. Why can't we summon the barbarian horde? We used to be able to do that. You can't do that in 5e. So yeah. We only need 4 classes for close to 10 years of the game, because they were not as tightly defined, and you could bend the class to suit the character concept. Yeah. But as time goes by, I think one of the only classes that I see there being problems with, potentially, is that the druid and the cleric kind of step on each other's toes. The worst culprit would definitely be the paladin and the cleric, because the paladin really is a cleric. Like, it makes no sense that they are distinct in themselves. Other than a name, do you know what I mean? They step on each other's toes. So yeah, I know there's been some arguments by some of the people in my group that we should just fold the paladin into the cleric, and they are essentially the same. What was another one that we sort of like, what's going on here? The warlock and the sorcerer, they don't feel, they feel essentially the same. They're definitely distinctive from the wizard, but the sorcerer and the warlock sort of feel like they are the same sort of class. Another one that sort of steps on the toes of all the classes is the bard. The bard is by far one of the strongest spellcasters out there, because it has access to just about everything. And yet for me, the bard class, I don't think it should be a spellcaster. I think it should be an inspirer, a singer, a player of instruments, a traveller who, voices poetry and writes literature and performs art and calls out the news and, but is a great speech giver. Like, their strength is in their music and in their voice. And that's where their power sort of lies, to inspire and assist others, rather than relying on all these spells from somewhere else. Do you know what I mean? Another one that definitely there's problems, and that is, I think the ranger and the rogue kind of step on each other's toes as well. Like, the ranger and the rogue, sometimes I don't feel like they're distinctive enough either. Do you know what I mean? I mean, you could say, yes, they are. You got Aragon, ranger, rogue, not the same thing. I get it. But yeah, when you look at it trying to make them distinctive, it's very hard to do that sometimes. Paladin started as a compromise, essentially letting a PC be a fighter cleric as a human when the dual class PC human wasn't allowed, and clerics were not allowed edged weapons. Yeah. See, there's another thing, like clerics not being able to use an edged weapon. That always annoyed me. I know where it comes from. I know why it's there, but I always thought it was silly. Anyway, so I thought I would share this, and my hope is that next week I will be able to start talking about Pathfinder 2nd Ed Edition. If I'm not talking about Pathfinder 2nd Ed Edition next week, I'm probably going to talk about BECMI, Dungeons and Dragons, or basic D&D rules and demonstrating those. Because BECMI, Dungeons and Dragons is very, very different to what you're probably used to if you haven't played the game. And then Pathfinder rules are very, very different now. Well, 2nd edition is very different to 1st ed edition and how the rules work. There's elements to it that are similar, but there is a lot of differences there. Anyway, I'm going to end this poll. Let's have a look and see what it says, and then I'm going to get myself to work because I was late last time. Do you use house rules in your Dungeons and Dragons 5e games? Yes, 58%. Cool. Sometimes 29%. Just watching 11%. So there's nobody here who doesn't. Druid started as an elite form of cleric with a different spell list and restrictions. Yeah. I that was our conclusion too. So I think the Druid will be one of the last things that I ever adjust or change or remaster, but it will happen because it needs to be distinctive enough from the cleric that it's its own thing, Anyway, I think I'm done. I've lost my voice just about. I should go to work. So I just want to say a big, huge thank you for everybody who's been watching and listening today. I don't know if this is necessarily hugely helpful to you, but hopefully it was. Hang on, what do you got here? Have you heard of Murders and Acquisitions game? No, I haven't. I haven't played it yet, but looks cool. No, I haven't. I'm still learning how to play BECMI or basic D&D. I'm still learning how to play Pathfinder 2nd edition. I'm still learning how to play Morkbork or Merkborky. Pirate Borg, I'm still learning how to play that. I'm also waiting for Fate to show up. So I don't think I'm going to be getting to anything else other than those for quite some time. Eventually, I hope to be able to sort of expand again a bit more. But yeah, I've got a lot of homework to do, and it takes time to learn a new system. And certainly, since I'm trying to present them and explain them in live streams and demonstrate them, yeah, it's just going to take even longer. What I will promise is that I will certainly try to release little shorts on these rules so that people can access them and find them quickly. Okay. So thank you for taking part in the poll. Thank you for hanging out in the chat, listening and commenting. Thank you, Andrew, for being here. Fred Huber, Overboard for hanging out. Hypnotic, it was great to have you. Cool Keg Computer, all of your comments. Kunchi245, it was great to have you. And hopefully tomorrow you'll join me while I rip the Barbarian for 5e to pieces and rebuild it into something else. Okay, so wherever you are in the world, whether it be the morning, okay, the afternoon or the night or the wee early morning, please look after yourself, your family and your friends. Be nice to your neighbours. And hey, till next time, keep rolling those 20s.